Hey guys, welcome to another best of episode of the Knowledge from the Couch podcast. I'm Kyle, your host, and this week's replay episode is your number 2 most downloaded episode of all time while listening to yours truly talk about historical stuff into a semi-decent microphone. This week's replay episode is episode number 17 from the Knowledge from the Couch podcast. This one might be basically my favorite one that I've done. It's kind of tough because the one that is number 1 is also one of my favorites, one of the excellent ones, but this one is about a man who is insane and did the most ridiculous shit that you can think of during World War II. The man's name was Jack Churchill, and he's a guy who went into a modern war, that war being World War II, with a broadsword and a bow and arrow and a bagpipe. That's what this dude did. It's a super ridiculous, super insane, interesting story, and it was the second most downloaded episode that I have from the past year. So guys, while we're still on our hiatus, enjoy the second most downloaded episode and your number 2 episode in the Knowledge from the Couch countdown from 4 to 1. This episode, number 2, Jack Churchill. Guys, enjoy the episode. And when you're done enjoying the episode, go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. You can do so through many avenues. Apple Podcasts is one of them. Spotify now is another one. Google Podcasts, Stitcher, any podcast app that you use is good enough to find this very show. If you enjoy the show and think somebody else out there in the land of listeners would enjoy this podcast, then go ahead and tell them about it. Have them go through these replays to find the best episodes that I've done according to you guys, and then let them jump in and listen to the rest of the back catalog. Guys, thank you so much for listening. Enjoy this episode. Jack Churchill, your number 2 most downloaded episode. The Knowledge from the Couch podcast. It's fun, it's interesting, it's weird, it's whatever you want it to be. Thanks for listening. What's up, guys? Welcome to episode 17 of the Knowledge from the Couch podcast. I'm Kyle, your host, with the most 17 plus episodes in. You know what, guys? It's been like 5 months and can't find a new host. It's just going to have to be me. You're just stuck with me so far, and that's fine. I figure if you're still listening to this show, thank you for sticking with me and my ridiculousness. And if you're new to the show, well, goodbye. It doesn't get a whole lot better than this. But hey, there's always an interesting story to be told, right? There's always something interesting going on. There's always something fun to talk about. There's always, on a weekly basis, and I have been making these shows basically on a week-to-week basis now instead of putting them in the can, so to speak, or packing a bunch of episodes away and getting ready for that stuff. I have a little bit more free time now. All I've really been doing right now is just working, which is easy, and studying for my boards test. Longtime listeners of the show might recall that I graduated nursing school on December the 15th, so about 3 weeks ago or so, about 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks ago, and my boards test is scheduled for January the 20th, so about 2.5 weeks from now. It is the test I have to pass to get my license to actually practice nursing in the state of Nebraska and every other state in these United States as well. So, studying for that isn't too terrible, just answering questions here and there, kind of keeping my mind sharp and stuff. I'm not too terrifically worried about the test. Obviously, I am worried because it's only my fucking life, I guess. But at the same time, there's no use in gathering social anxiety, and I don't mean social anxiety, but test anxiety. There's no reason to gather anxiety in any way about this test, because it is what it is. After 4 years of school, thousands of hours of clinical, and tens of thousands of questions answered, there really is no reason to be too fearful. The only fearful thing is you put in all that time and you hope you don't fail the test. That is your final measure before you can transition from being a student of nursing, a student of anything, into a professional into a professional concept, of at least the novice nurse, and then so on and so forth until experience is gathered. So to make that extremely long story a little bit shorter, I have been obviously just kind of doing those two things. I don't have school right now, or hopefully for a while yet, until I decide, inevitably to gather some sort of advanced degree. But until that point, I don't have much school. I'm just really doing questions and studying for that test. So I have a little bit more free time than I had in the days before. So I can actually pop these episodes really pretty close to the time that I actually released them. In fact, the last, I think, 3 or 4 episodes that I've done either on the Wednesday or the Thursday right before I publish them on Fridays. So, I push it up against the wall a little bit, but it's interesting, and this goes back to the very first point I made. There's always somebody weird and interesting to speak about, or to talk about, or to expand upon every single week. Sometimes I'm like, man, there's nobody left to talk about that's fun. Like, I have no clue who I want to talk about. And I'll look at a couple people, I'm like, this stupid story, or I don't know if I can make this that interesting. I don't know, whatever. And sure enough, every single week, I always fall upon someone who is going to be interesting, who is going to be somebody who is going to make a good story that is worthy of this shitty podcast. I have standards too, I have standards too. And this week, we are going to talk about a crazy English person who fought with ancient weapons. But get this, and that doesn't seem weird, right? Because there are plenty of ancient peoples from the British Isles and even into the Middle Ages, from the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, and so on. There are plenty of people who have used less advanced weaponry in English history. Only problem with this guy is that he was using this weaponry in the 20th century. So we're going to talk about Jack Churchill today. We're going to get right into it right now. Nice and short little intro monologue for this episode 17 of Knowledge from the Couch podcast. Guys, stick with me. Okay, Jack Churchill. I should say, interestingly enough, this is our second Englishman in a row that we've done. The only thing that separates him is about 400 or so paltry little years in between Guy Fawkes and Mr. Churchill here. No relation, by the way, to Winston Churchill, the more famous and more well-known of the two men. Jack Churchill, he's a real interesting cat. This guy did a lot of shit in his life, and a very interesting way to go along it. So, So Jack was born in 1906, actually in Hong Kong. At this time, if you are a student of geographical history, Hong Kong was a part of the United Kingdom. And it was, I believe, until the 90s when it was then ceded back to Chinese rule. Although we could probably get into that in a later episode because Hong Kong is kind of China and also isn't really China. It's its own sort of special district and they do their own thing, whatever. At the point when he was born in September of 1906 in Hong Kong as a British citizen. He was raised there until he eventually went to England and graduated from the Royal Military College in Sandhurst in 1926. After he graduated from the Royal Military College in Sandhurst in 1926, he joined the military. Obviously, he was part of the military, being a military graduate, but he went back to, I wouldn't say back to exactly where he's from. Obviously, he was born in Hong Kong. He went to Burma to go serve as a member of the Manchester Regiment, which was stationed in Burma at the time. And this is an interwar time, so this is in between World War I and at that point known as the Great War, World War I and World War II, which wouldn't break out, obviously, for another decade or so. So he's just hanging out in Burma, doing his thing. The thing you got to realize about Jack Churchill, born John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, what a name. We'll just call him Jack, also known as Fighting Jack Churchill or the Mad Jack. He was definitely a likes-to-fight guy. This is a dude who, I don't know, it's a strange when you look at him because he did so many, he was a very eclectic guy, did a lot of different things, but goddamn, he just loved to just get in there and brawl. I mean, there was nothing that made this dude happier than getting into a fight with somebody for, you know, whatever patriotic reason that he had in his head. And he was a very, stiff upper lip type of English patriot. He just loved getting in there. That's why he joined the military. That's why he went to the Royal Military College in Sandhurst and was part of the military because he wanted to be a guy who would do sort of stuff like that. So he was involved in the Burma Rebellion there in 1930 up to 1932. During his time in the military down there, he loved just hanging out, riding his bike around, and he kind of just sort of got bored. During his time when he was bored down in Burma, he basically became an archer, taught himself to be an archer, became super good at it, by the way, and that'll come in handy later on. Became a super good archer, taught himself to play the bagpipes. It's so funny, too, because he got into this really, like, Scottish mode, even though he himself, was born in Hong Kong, and was hardly, like a native Scotsman, but he was very much a Scottish man at heart. So he goes, learns to be an archer, becomes awesome at it, teaches himself how to play the bagpipes, so he could do that. That's fun. And eventually, teaches himself to be extremely proficient with a Scottish broadsword, or a claymore, it might better be known as. Just sort of a big old sword that you could carry around in battle. Definitely something that you would probably end up using with two hands, or one if you're a super badass like Jack Churchill. So this is all the things he's doing kind of in the 20s and the 30s after he graduated school and was hanging out in Burma. Eventually, because there's no real conflict going on, Churchill leaves the British Army in 1936 after about 10 years of service, and he goes and works as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya. Of all places, I'm going to go to Kenya and be a newspaper editor because he's just this cosmopolitan guy. He's just like a world traveler, a free spirit at heart. This guy just wants to go places, see places, maybe punch a dude in the face when he's at a place, and then continue on with his life. So he goes and works as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya. And cool enough, we got our own Derek Zoolander on our hands here. Jack Churchill also becomes a male model because apparently he's handsome as shit. So this dude just, likes to fight guy. I'm going to go ride my bicycle around and my motorcycle around. I'm going to learn how to be an archer. I'm going to carry this sweet sword around. I'm going to play the fucking bagpipes. I'm going to go be a newspaper editor in Kenya. And also, hey, by the way, I'm super handsome. I guess I'm a male model now. He actually, if you go look, He played a role in the 1924 film. This would have happened during his college days in the Thief of Baghdad, which is I guess a film. I am not familiar with this movie at all, but he apparently was in the 1924 film, The Thief of Baghdad, playing his bagpipes. And then he was also in a 1938 film, much closer to the wartime that would break out, called A Yank at Oxford. Doing bagpipe stuff, being a bagpipe man, being handsome as fuck. This is at this point Jack Churchill's life, just kind of doing whatever. He actually became so good at archery that he represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo, Norway in 1939. Now, if we're thinking about history, and you're still with me here, thinking and talking about history, if you had to guess what sort of weird, crazy, humongous world event took place in Europe in 1939, if you guessed that the outbreak of World War II took place in 1939, you'd be exactly correct. Germany invades Poland in 1939, kicking off what everybody in Europe knew was going to happen for the last decade. Because when you think about the economics of the entire situation, in World War I, you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you have Germany, so you have basically these two giant combatants, and you have others as well on their side. And then you have allied powers, I guess. These would have been like the Central Powers and Allied Powers in World War I, which would eventually sort of be known as Axis powers in World War II and Allied powers in World War II. So you have this conflict going on in the 19 teens, the World War I times, that absolutely devastates Europe. I recommend if you're really into World War history, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast, Blueprint for Armageddon, I believe, is the one that he covers World War I in, I would say, extremely exhausting detail. I think it's 4 parts. It might be 5 parts, but they're like 3 or 4 hours long a piece. So if you want to really get into like some real gritty-ass World War I shit, go listen to his podcast. Go waste. I wouldn't say waste. Go hang out with him. It's not a waste, especially if you're into it. Go hang out with him for like 20 straight hours and listen to it. It's amazing. But to make that long story extremely short, Europe is extremely devastated from World War I. It's a horrible thing. Just so many fucking people die. World War I was like a crossroads between, and this sort of actually plays into our story today, is a crossroads between older technology in war and new technology in war. So you still had people in World War I riding horses around as cavalry, using swords, using muskets even, or very old rifles. And then this meets with the modern era of giant, howitzer-type cannons, giant artillery, more advanced guns, machine guns, this and that. So, people were just dying by the fucking thousands in World War I. I mean, it wasn't even crazy to think that you could kill, like, tens of thousands of men in a single night just not from any sort of crazy bombing or anything, just blowing the fuck out of them with artillery and machine guns. I mean, real just gritty, nasty way to just annihilate so many people, to the point where all of Europe basically just becomes this trench dug hellhole where guys would just fight for weeks and months on end to make up like 6 yards of territory. I mean, it was absolutely brutal, everything that went along with that war. So brutal, in fact, that it just absolutely tanked the economy of the entirety of Europe, but especially the economy of Germany. Germany being, obviously the major belligerent in World War II. Everybody at the end of this war, after Germany finally surrenders, and Austria-Hungary finally everybody surrenders. In the treaty thereafter, everybody's like, "Hey, Germany, you know what? Fuck you, dude. This is your fault. You did this. This is your bad. So hey, by the way, you're gonna pay reparations to all of us because we didn't want to get in this goddamn fight to begin with. But here you go." And you're just going to pay us, and you're going to pay for all this bullshit. Well, when you're and don't get me wrong, Germany is not a small country by any means, but Europe is huge. Europe is very highly populated. These days, I think somewhere around, I want to say 500 to 600 million people live in Europe. more than the United States, obviously. They're packed in there a lot tighter, too. But even then, obviously, a lot more people lived in Europe than in the United States. So you just had this super dense, people, so many countries everywhere, and they're all sort of just leaning on these central powers to pay for the damages of the war. Well, what do you think that's going to do to any country's economy, especially a smaller, type of country trying to prop up everybody else? It absolutely fucking destroys it. And that destruction of the economy basically devalues Germany's money completely, utterly, because to keep up with having to pay stuff off, the currency gets inflated and inflated and inflated as more money is printed to the point where it's like Zimbabwe money. Like, you got like just billions and trillions of dollars in paper money, and it is worth nothing, basically. It's worth tinder for fire. That's about the best that you can do with that sort of money. Well, eventually this leads to a rife populism in Germany where, it becomes this, us versus them mentality. Hey, we're Germans. We are superior. Why is this happening to us? Why should we have to do all this bullshit? Why should we have to pay for other people's shit when, this and that? And this is, like 20 plus years now removed from the original conflict, the Great War, World War I. And you get a fella named Adolf Hitler just jumping in there, along with a bunch of other yes men as well, and using this sort of mentality, this sort of narrative of, hey, why should we have to pay for all this bullshit? We're the best. We're superior. Fuck that shit. And people are on his side, because if you're poor as hell and everything just seems like it's down and out against you, what are you going to do? How, when we think about World War I into World War II and how things progress, I know this doesn't have much to do with Jack Churchill. I'm just trying to, as we always do, I'm just trying to set up a little bit of context for the situation. Because of my own brain, this is the way it works. You're looking at a country that has basically absolutely just been shit pounded for years. What are they going to do? They're going to go straight at it again. So most people in Europe kind of saw the writing on the wall that, the Great War was not going to be the last Great War fought in Europe because of things that happened. And one of the biggest mistakes was making Germany the whipping boy of the rest of Europe after the first conflict, because it just led into this second conflict. But one guy who was mega happy to get back into the fighting was a man named Jack Churchill, our Mad Jack himself. He was very into this war. So he goes and represents Great Britain in the World Archery Championships in Oslo in 1939, and a little bit after that, the Second World War breaks out. Now, remember, he's not in the Army anymore. He left in 1936 after 10 years in the military, but you can be goddamn certain that he was like, I'm back, I'm in, fuck it, man. I only been out for a few years, throw me back into it, bitch, let's do it. I'm finally going to go kick some ass, it's going to be sweet. So, the British Army recommissions him, and he joins the British Expeditionary Force in World War II after the Germans had invaded Poland. So they go over to France, and this is in May of 1940 now. So the World War II timeline, Germany invades Poland in September of 39. They roll their ass all over fucking Europe and take over just shitloads of territory, including France at this point. France was absolutely devastated, just like Germany was post World War I. So when Germany was able to remobilize their forces and go nonstop, France had no way to defend themselves. They just couldn't. They just got their asses beat into the ground during World War I. Just so many people were fucked and died. The Western Front was in France. So, as it's 20 years now since the end of World War II, or World War I, excuse me. That's not enough time. That's still basically within almost the same exact generation as the previous one. I mean, very nearly. 20 years is just barely enough time to have a generation or so pass between each war. So it's still fresh. The wounds and the cuts given are still fresh in the minds of everybody. So Germany steamrolls everybody, including France. Jack Churchill and his boys are in the British Expeditionary Force. They then go to France in May of 1940. Churchill and his old school unit, the Manchester Regiment, him and his boys, they get into it. They get going.
Now let's paint a picture super quick of this guy before we go any farther. Now, he wasn't only a badass because he was a fucking weirdo and wanted to do weird shit with his life. He was a badass because he was an insane person. Now, most guys in World War II decided that when they went into combat, they were going to go into combat with their trusty rifles or machine guns or whatever they were going to carry. And that was that. Well, Mr. Churchill here decided that he wasn't going to do any of that shit, and that he was much more of a, I guess, a sort of a gentleman, an older timed soldier, from a different era. Oftentimes, when he was going into combat, Mr. Churchill was armed with a sword, the aforementioned Scottish broadsword, a fucking longbow, and sometimes he would carry his goddamn bagpipes with him too. That was what he did. He carried a fucking bow and arrow, a sword, and bagpipes into combat. No gun. He didn't fucking need a gun. Why would this guy need a gun? He was too much of a badass to need a gun. So he joins the British Expeditionary Force. God, this is such a fucking word. Expeditionary Force. And they go into the shitstorm known as France in the 1940s. And they immediately get caught up into that just fuck pounding that Hitler's, German blitzkrieg force is just doing to everybody. If you are familiar with this time period as well, this is around the time that Dunkirk was taking place. So if you've seen that movie, then you might be familiar with sort of the circumstances surrounding the BEF during the time. But him and his unit are thrown into this conflict, and then basically it's just a gigantic retreat to Dunkirk. But Mr. Churchill is basically just a savage guerrilla commando, and he doesn't give a fuck what people think. So he's just a guy from a different era. He's definitely got that World War I mentality, even though he was not an officer by any means during that conflict. He definitely had that mentality in his head that if he was going to give up territory, he sure as shit wasn't going to give it up for free. So he would always lead these like guerrilla kind of commando style raids and stuff against German forces, with a few men here and there. And he would always just go and fuck people up. I mean, can you imagine him just leading a command against German forces with a goddamn sword in his hand? Like, hey, what's up, guys? I got this sword, I got this bow, and I'm going to shoot people with it, like he's fucking Robin Hood with his merry men just jumping in there and, punching a few faces and then jumping straight out like ghosts. But this is what he did. As they were making their retreat to Dunkirk, the British force, he and his boys would jump in and out, Mr. Churchill with a sword, of all things, and they would just make shit happen. They would just beat people up. And it was just this insane thing. I mean, can you even imagine a guy in modern war acting like that? It's a different era. You just couldn't even have a guy like that these days, but you definitely still could during the Second World War, and that was the type of guy that Jack Churchill was. Mad Jack Churchill running in with this sword and bow and arrow and just making shit happen. He was quoted actually in saying when people were like, dude, what are you carrying a sword into combat for? I mean, we got guns, man. If you want to grab a gun, there's a box in the back. You can go get a gun, dude. It's cool if you want to have a gun during the World War II, during a modern 20th century war, man. We'll get you a machine gun. And he responds, quote, in my opinion, sir, any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed, unquote. That is an extremely British thing to say. This guy from Hong Kong may be the most British person on earth. More British than the Queen, more British than James Bond. Jack Churchill might be the most British man alive, which is funny because he is so British, yet he is also very Scottish. Even though he isn't Scottish, for some reason, his heart was hanging out up in the Highlands of Scotland because he really loved that Scottish sword. He really loved that goddamn set of bagpipes. He would. Those are going to come into play here fairly soon, but we'll get to that, in a sec. He was during the Dunkirk portion of the war. He was the weirdest, most eccentric dude ever. I mean, like I was saying, he was just in there guerrilla killing everybody. And he was doing it like, oh, ho-hum, this is just my life now. This is just what we do, is we just ride around. I mean, literally, he would get on his trusty motorcycle and just ride around being a crazy person with his bow strapped to him and his sword flailing around. He was just driving his little motorcycle around, just causing shit to go down. At one point, during part of the retreat to Dunkirk with the 4th Infantry Brigade. He took command of his company when his company commander was wounded, and it was during this fight that he hit a German soldier, the Feldwebel, or the staff sergeant of the German force that was attacking them, with a goddamn arrow in the throat. He was sitting in a tower, saw this happening, said, okay, he literally said, I'm going to shoot that guy with an arrow, and then proceeded to shoot that guy with an arrow, a barbed arrow of all things, and killed the guy, being the only man to kill a man with an arrow in World War II. Literally, this guy is just out there fucking Oliver Queen style, just arrows flying around everywhere, killing people. He does that during this portion. He's driving around on his motorcycle a little bit later on and sees an officer that he used to work with, that it was his little buddy from the old days in the Manchester Regiment. He's driving around his motorcycle. His bow is tied to the frame. Arrows are just sticking out everywhere. And he's got a German officer's cap hanging on the headlight, because I'm assuming, I mean, there's no story to go along with that, but I'm assuming he, like, in the dead of night, just jumped in and just, like, beheaded some German dude with his fucking sword, and then took his hat, and it was like, oh, chip, chip, cheerio, I got this hat. Motorcycle, drive away. And he's got this thing hanging in his headlight. He sees his buddy, and he says, oh, hello, Clark, got anything to drink? Like it's no fucking big deal. Like he just sees his friend. He's like, hey, man, you want to go grab a beer super quick? I just got done killing a German dude and a bunch of his friends, like a savage that I truly am. Let's go have a pint, mate. So this happens, obviously, during the retreat to Dunkirk. He gets off his motorcycle after seeing his buddy. His friend notices that he's got a bunch of blood on his face and his the side of his neck and his ear. And he goes, hey, man, what happened to you? And he's like, oh, yeah, just a German machine gun happened to me. Oh, just, super casual. Like, I went and killed a German guy. I rode my motorcycle here. Hey, dude, let's have a pint. Oh, what happened to me? Oh, no big deal. Just German machine gun. Whatever. It's all good. I was just too tired to run, so I got shot. It's fine. Because of this, he won his first military cross during that retreat. At this time, he also really tried a weird thing. He tried to attempt to get a tank unstuck by hitching 6 trucks together to salvage that tank. Didn't work out, but he did end up saving a dude. So that's fun. But during this whole time, I mean, this guy is just out there with his sword going crazy. Kills a guy with a fucking arrow. Tries to get a bunch of trucks together to rescue a tank. Says hey to a dude who's his friend. Want to get a beer. Oh, who shot me? It doesn't matter. German machine gun. Who gives a shit? I'm fine. Let's go get a beer, dude. I got my bow and my arrow. Let's go fucking do it. And that's it. I mean, he eventually makes it to Dunkirk. They survive the encounter. They push back Nazi forces, and then he is then taken back to England, shipped back, and getting ready for the next chapter, the next theater of the war. Well, befitting a man like Mad Jack, the British Army was developing a new division of their military called the Commandos. Well, Jack Churchill didn't know what the fuck a commando even was, but when he heard about the aggressive training and what they were going to do, he was all for it. He didn't give a shit what a commando was, as long as he could be a fucking insane badass. He was more than willing to become a part of that situation. So he joins the Commandos. They complete their super grueling, awful training, which he fucking loves. Of course he does. And they head up on a mission in Norway. This will be then in the winter of 1941. So cold as fuck. It's Norway in December. So obviously not going to be a thing that is just, this nice temperate climate or anything. And he doesn't give a shit. He loves it. He's just like Scottish in his heart and blood. He just loves that the hills and the water and the cold and just the and the bagpipes and do whatever the fuck you want. So much that when they're making their way up to Vagsøy in Norway to take place, with Operation Archery, what it's called. Not because of him shooting bows and arrows and shit, just kind of a coincidence, but oddly perfect for him. So during Operation Archery, the British were going to send forces up to Vagsøy, Norway, because there were Germans encamped up there at the time, and they were going to make a landing at that beach and they were just going to go take out all this artillery. Well, motherfucking this guy, Jack Churchill, is like, here we go. Sits on the very front of his amphibious vehicle, getting ready to get out of the vehicle to go, up on land and go do this thing. And he's just blasting straight up on his bagpipes. He doesn't give a shit. He's just like, well, bagpipe time. And he gets his bagpipes out and he starts playing the March of the Cameron Men, just blasting it. This is December 27th now of 1941. Making this shit happen. Door pops open, and then there's this guy with all his dudes behind him. This guy just blasting bagpipes. He gets done, pulls his sword out, and they just run onto the beach, and they fucking win. They make stuff happen. It's insane. So they take Malloy, which is part of this Vagsoy area, and they kill a bunch of dudes, and take a bunch of other dudes prisoner, and the entire thing is just a total roaring success. So much so that they basically inflict about double the casualties and both deaths and injuries against German forces. They sink about 15,000 tons of shipping, and it gets Adolf Hitler so shaking in his boots, so like, oh, what do I do? That he ends up diverting a bunch of forces up into Norway, into this same area, which probably could have been used at literally any other area in the war theater, because he was so scared of guys like Churchill just blasting through in Norway and taking out, other Scandinavian posts of Nazi Germany, that he diverts a bunch of forces there in a dumb ass move, and then basically, takes defensive forces away from literally every other place. And the fact that the British were so goddamn good at that amphibious landing and destroying their shit and taking everybody prisoner, that literally Germans just never could really sleep again at night if they were on a beachhead, because that insane devilish ghost man with a sword and bow and arrow was going to come and haunt them and just take their asses out. So a very successful Operation Archery, taking out that German garrison in Vagsoy, Norway. Guy plays his bagpipes, chucks a grenade. By the way, that was probably his one modern use of technology. Threw a grenade after he got done playing his bagpipes, and then gets his sword out and just starts going ape shit. Ends up earning him his second military cross. He earned one for Dunkirk, and then he earns one for here as well. Well, of course, that's not the end of Mad Jack Churchill's fight, by no means. In fact, one of the most insane things that he does happens here in 1943. While in command of Commando Number 2, he was in Number 3 Commando on the onslaught in Norway. He's in charge of Number 2 Commando in 1943 in Italy, and him and his dudes, along with some Americans and some others as well, are making headway into a town called Piagoletti in Italy. Now, his assignment was to neutralize the German artillery and find a way to, get them out of that town and make it happen. Well, Jack doesn't have all that many dudes. He actually only has 50 men, and he's trying to figure out a way to get into this town and make this work. He knows he's outnumbered probably 3-1, and he's just trying to figure out, okay, how can we get our guys in here and make some shit happen? Well, being the insane genius he really is in terms of war, and you always kind of see that with people like this. It's like, in normal life, you might not think of this guy as anything other than just a normal, everyday, kind of a weirdo guy. But when war happens, all of a sudden, there's some sort of, click in his head that turns on his inner genius. So, waiting for the cover of night. And now he knows that there's a bunch of heavy undergrowth and shrubbery and all that kind of stuff near the town that definitely they're not going to be able to get through silently. So, normally at night they might try to sneak in, be really quiet, and do their work there. But he knows that there's no way that they're going to be able to sneak into the town. So what he does is, he splits his team up into 6 parallel lines of guys. So just a few, just a dozen guys per line or so. And he gets them all spread out really wide. And then instead of trying to sneak into the town through the undergrowth, he literally has them just yell commando, like the word commando. Okay. So all of his dudes are just screaming commando and firing their guns and making a whole bunch of ruckus as they advance in the town. Well, the Germans don't know what the fuck is going on because it's he spreads the line of his men out so far and wide, and with the gunfire and the screaming and the chaos, the Germans think there are a lot more guys coming for them than there actually are. So he kind of tricks them into thinking, hey, there's a huge force surrounding us. Holy shit, we got to dig ourselves in and we have to defend ourselves. They're not going to come out, and use their actual superior numbers to win a fight. They're so confused that they dig themselves in. Well, then, like a true commando, Jack and a guy he brings with him, just a non-commissioned officer named Ruffle, Corporal Ruffle, him and this one guy, there's two of them, they go into the town themselves. They sneak in. He gets his sword out, because of course he does, and he's ready to go. They find themselves sneaking around. They see a couple of German soldiers digging in around them. He sees a cigarette lit in the darkness, knowing where they are. Him and his buddy capture these two German sentry guys. And he basically runs in. The Germans see him. He's got this sword blade just gleaming in the night, showing, hey, man, what up? I'm a fucking insane person with a sword. Do what I say. And he screams, Heidenhock! And they're like, oh, okay, I guess we're going to stop now, because they're German guys. They just hear this screaming banshee demon out of nowhere. And they're like, oh, I guess we'll give up. So him and Ruffle capture this guy. They force them to carry their weapons with them, where he takes the bolts out of their gun, throws them in a sack. He carries the sack around while the Germans basically carry a bunch of weapons that are useless. And him and Ruffle proceed to go around the camp and capture a total of 42 guys with this technique. 42 dudes with these just 42 guys. And they round them up, and they eventually gather them around with a total of 136 prisoners being captured total with this company of 50 men led by Mad Jack. 136 guys are captured, including 42 by him and Ruffle themselves, and then they just march them on down to become prisoners. And a funny quote by Churchill himself says the reason why he allowed his guys his prisoners to bring their arms with them. Quote, I always bring my prisoners back with their weapons. It weighs them down. I just took their rifle bolts out and put them in a sack, which one of the prisoners carried. They also carried the mortar and all the bombs they could carry, and also pulled a farm car with 5 wounded in it. I maintain that as long as you tell a German loudly and clearly what to do, if you are senior to him, he will cry, Jawohl, and get on with it enthusiastically and efficiently, whatever the situation. That's why they make such marvelous soldiers, unquote. So he's just an absolute genius of warfare. Can you imagine just this guy jumping out of a bush with a sword, screaming German at you? You're just like a German conscript soldier. You're not an SS officer or anything. You're just a German army corporal, and you're just like, what the fuck do? I guess I give up. I don't want to get my head chopped off by this crazy person, so I guess I give up. We've heard of you, dude. We don't want anything to do with your crazy ass. I surrender. You take me and my buddy with me. It's gonna be fine. So that's Mad Jack in 1943, kicking ass in Italy. He then goes to the Yugoslav area in 1944 to keep fighting and keep kicking ass. Well, unfortunately for Mr. Churchill, his war luck was finally going to run out on him. So he and his guys are trying to attack this sort of really entrenched, artillery-covered area, and it was going to take the cooperation of a lot of the forces, including his own commando troop, to go make it happen. Well, he leads this troop in this, of course, crazy, yelling, insane, sword-brandishing, bow and arrow position up the hills in this Yugoslav island that they're fighting on now, and trying to overrun these positions, making it, very commando-y type of thing to do. Well, probably not the smartest idea, because a whole bunch of dudes got killed on the way up, attacking this position. Churchill was not one of them, although by the time they got up there, he quickly finds himself isolated with only a handful of defenders around him. There were only 6 commandos with him on the hilltop, and 3 of them were wounded, 2 of them really fucking wounded. Well, Churchill says, quote, I was distressed to find that everyone was armed with revolvers except myself. Of course, he's like, oh, damn it. Everybody's got a gun, and I don't have a gun. Oh, well, I guess, fuck it. I don't give a shit. Literally, he says, fuck it. I don't give a shit. He sees what's going on and says, you know what? This is probably the end for me. You know, I had a good run, boys. We kicked a lot of ass. I sworded a lot of people in the throat. I killed a guy with a bow and arrow. I'm an insane person. If this is going to be how it ends, then I want nothing more than to end my life in war. Pulls out his bagpipes, because of course he's carrying his trusty bagpipes with him in this fucking fight, and starts playing the tune, Will Ye No Come Back Again? And he's just like, I'm just going to die. I'm going to play a sweet bagpipe song, and I'm going to die. Well, he's knocked unconscious eventually by a German grenade. Not killed, knocked unconscious when a German frag grenade goes off near him, but not so near him that it kills him. And he regains consciousness later to discover that German soldiers are prodding people, you know, on the battlefield. This is after the battle is over, trying to find who is still alive. Well, Churchill eventually, I guess, since he is one of those alive people that they're prodding, is then captured and sent to a POW camp. But this would not be the end of the insanity of Mad Jack Churchill. So he goes to prison. He is first he goes to Berlin because the Germans discover his name, Jack Churchill, and think that, oh, hey, this guy is related to Winston Churchill. We should definitely take him to Berlin to interrogate him, because obviously he's a relative of the terrible commander of those goddamn British forces, so we got to talk to him. Then they discover he's not, because he's a badass, and of course he can just take any sort of interrogation anybody throws at him. They discover he is not related to Winston Churchill, and they then send him to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in Germany. Well, there's no concentration camp on Earth that's going to hold fucking Jack Churchill in. So he's hanging out in this awful concentration camp. But one night, in a very ballsy move, him and an RAF officer, RAF being the Royal Air Force, another Britishman, they crawl out of the concentration camp under the cover of darkness through, I guess, an abandoned drain pipe or an unused drain pipe underneath the barbed wire. They go, hey, we're going to crawl out of this thing and we're going to make our way towards the Baltic coast and get the fuck out of here. They get pretty far. They're recaptured, unfortunately, but they get within 3 miles of a coastal city, which, you know, they would have probably been able to hitch a ride on a boat somewhere and get the fuck out of there. Well, unfortunately, they were recaptured. But instead of just killing Churchill, I guess the Germans had some sort of weird respect for him, I guess, and decide that, hey, man, I guess we're just going to continue to send you to other concentration camps. They then send him to a concentration camp in Austria, in southern Austria near the Alps. So he's hanging out in this concentration camp. So he's sent to the Sachsenhausen in 1944 after being captured. And then in 1945, he's hanging out in this particular concentration camp. Well, being the opportunistic guy that he was, one night in April, the camp's lighting system just shorts out and fails. Well, Churchill is just like, well, fuck it, I'm out of here now. Goodbye. Decides to walk away from his work detail. He disappears into the darkness night and just walks away, fucking out of there. He walks 150 fucking miles through really difficult, Alps type area. Like, it's kind of like, I would say it's probably similar to like if you were hiking around in the Rocky Mountains in some of those tough ass terrains and altitude and shit. He didn't give a fuck. He was like, goodbye, and just walked out of the camp after the lighting fails, walks 150 miles through the Alps, quote, liberating vegetables, unquote, from Austrian gardens and cooking them in his tin can that he picked up. And that's how he basically stays alive and just keeps walking, Eventually, like I said, he walks 150 miles for Verona, where eventually he hitches a ride with a bunch of Americans that he finds. On the 8th day of his escape, hobbling along on a sprained ankle, he finds a column of armored vehicles. Well, he sees that they're American. Hooray. He managed to flag down one of the vehicles and persuade the crew that in spite of his scruffy appearance, because obviously he's been a prisoner of war for like a year now, looking like shit, that he was a British colonel. He convinces them that this is true, and even though they probably have no real reason to believe him, the Americans are like, yeah, man, you seem like a fucking insane person that you could only be a weirdo British guy, so you're definitely British. Cool, man. So they ship his ass back to England, where he belongs. Well, fucking none of this is going to stop the maverick spirit of Jack Churchill. He doesn't want to stop fighting. After all that bullshit, after all the things he's done and been through, he still doesn't want to stop fighting. So he gets back to England and says, well, fuck it, man. I'm gonna keep fighting. You know, the war in Europe at this point is basically over. But the war is still going on in Japan. So he figures, okay, well, I'm going to head that way, and I'm going to keep fighting and keep making it happen. So he's on a train towards his old Burma, and he's just going to make it happen there, because in Burma, this is still a large land war being waged against Japanese forces. It's still going on there. So he figures, fuck it, man, I'm going back. We're going to make it happen. I'm going to take my sword and my bow, and we're going to make it. We're going to make it. And then Americans drop a bomb of the atomic nature on Hiroshima, and then later on at Nagasaki, where the Japanese, they're like, well, that's a little bit too much, so we need to surrender. And in frustrating fashion, he does not get a fight in that war again. He's very mad. Of course he is. Of course a guy who's been through all this shit, who wants to keep fighting, is mad that the war, this insane, huge, long war, is finally over. He was quoted as saying, and only probably half jokingly, that, quote, if it hadn't been for the damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going for another 10 years. That's the kind of guy that he was. But was Jack done fighting? Fuck no. Of course he wasn't done fighting. He later becomes a parachutist in the Seaforth Highlander Force, where he is then sent down to British Palestine post-World War II in 1948. Now, this is about the time that the British Mandate is about to happen, which makes a new Jewish homeland, a formalized Israel, out of the area that at this point is Palestine. So that's a whole nother fucking thing brewing that we're definitely not going to talk about in this episode, which is already extremely long. But yes, he's down there during the fight, and he actually ends up saving a medical convoy during this time, because he uses his sweet military genius to sense that, hey, there's like a bombing that's about to happen on this convoy. Holy shit. Drives down in a little Jeep car and manages to radio, and everything is saved because of his insanity and his as absolute military genius, and being able to recognize those sort of things from happening. Eventually, though, like all good things, his military career has to come to an end. He then spends some of his retirement years shooting in more films. He's actually in Ivanhoe as an archer, shooting stuff, from the walls of a castle. So if you go watch Ivanhoe, you might see our boy Jack up in there. He eventually becomes a instructor at the Land Air Warfare School in Australia, where, of course, he becomes a passionate devotee of the surfboard. So this weird, crazy military guy is also, totally a surfer dude as well. So he gets way back into that. And then he goes back to England after he's done teaching at the Land and Air Warfare School in Australia, and becomes the first man to ride the River Severn's 5-foot tidal bore. Because why wouldn't you? Just a weirdo surfing in England, making it happen. He eventually gets a desk job with the Army, which he values greatly, because he loves watching what he called the enthusiastic cadets. And this job gave him an office in Horse Guards at Whitehall, and a window from which he could watch troopers of the Household Cavalry mounting guard in a courtyard below him. So he never would fight in a war again, but he was always going to be a warrior, right? This guy, of all people I think I've ever really talked about, minus maybe our sniper Simo from a few episodes ago, truly encapsulates the warrior spirit like Jack Churchill did. And that's it. I mean, he lived all the way until 1996, so I'm glad to say that him and I spent 11 years on this earth together. We may not have ever met each other, and knowing his story now, that makes me a little sad, because he seems like a fucking awesome dude. But he lived, all the way up to 1996, where he passed away in Surrey very peacefully in his home. And he leaves a legacy of total and complete insanity, as well as being a guy who could kill guys in a modern war with swords and bows, and he was always willing to jump up and take the opportunity to play his bagpipes, shoot a guy with an arrow, and just absolutely make it happen. And he was just the happiest guy ever. A guy whose element truly was war. A guy who probably wasn't very into the thought of the suffering and the death of war, but was always, excited by the chance to do better, to excel, to make things happen. Jack is one of the most interesting figures in World War II, and there are a lot of interesting figures that took place during that particular war. Interesting guy, right? Interesting fella. So now, without further ado, let's just, as we do, I've still, after, damn near 20 episodes, I still haven't found a good segue into the second portion, but we're going to hit it. I bought another Snapple, guys. We're going to hit that Snapple cap. Back to the week right now. Well, this fact comes to you courtesy of a delicious peach tea, as I am wont to get. This real fact, this Snapple fact of the week, is real fact number 120. The only continent without reptiles or snakes is Antarctica. Very appropriate, as Nebraska, my home state, the state from which I hail, was fucking colder than Antarctica last week. So, wonderful. There you go. Thanks, Snapple. And that's all she wrote, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in another week with me on the Knowledge from the Couch podcast. I have been Kyle, your host. You can follow me on Twitter at Kyle Steinhauser, on Instagram at Kyle F. Steinhauser. You can find the show page on Facebook, search Knowledge from the Couch. I've forgotten to say this the last 10 episodes because very few emails come in, but we do have an email address, knowledgecouch@gmail.com. If you have to pretend like you're from 1997 and want to send me an email, you can certainly do it there. This is a call for action for all my listeners. Again, I would like more suggestions for topics to do from the show. I've actually done a few that people have suggested, but as I stated at the top of the show, here and there and everywhere, it is kind of a pain to try to think of a topic every single week sometimes. So if you guys would like to continue to send me suggestions, you can either message me if you know me personally, or you can email the show. You can email me personally. You can contact me on Twitter. It's wherever you want to contact me. Send me some more suggestions on stuff to do. There are a few topics that I am saving that I have been suggested for when I expand the show to actually have other people on it besides just me. So I'm fine with you suggesting those things again, and if that's part of your suggestions, but just note that I didn't forget about you. I didn't forget about your suggestions. They're not falling on deaf ears. I am just saving a few of those. For example, the Tesla versus Edison suggestion I've gotten from actually 4 different people. Very interesting historical topic. I would like to do that one with more than just me, because that's one that is fun to talk about with other people. So continue to send me your suggestions. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts. You can find it on Stitcher. You can find it literally wherever podcasts are. Make sure that you rate the show and that you leave a comment. If you leave a comment, I will read it as part of the outro monologue. I will read your comment about the show. That's fun, right? That's a thing people do. Otherwise, guys, I don't have anything else to do. Episode 18 next week. I have no clue, per the use, what we're doing. That's why I asked for suggestions. Guys, until then, thanks for listening to this nearly hour-long show. Maybe it is an hour long. I don't know. I guess we'll see. But, guys, thank you so much for listening. You are my favorite people in the world. This is what I was forgetting. This week, I actually didn't use a DJ Quad song. I had been for the last probably month and a half or so. But both the segue song and the outro song are from a guy named Blue Wednesday. I'm going to link his SoundCloud profile in the show notes for this episode. So go check him out. He also has weird, cool, interesting music. So now that I've gotten that plug out of the way, the most important plug for the person actually probably putting out the most useful content for the episode at large. Thank you so much for listening, guys. Until next week, we'll see you then. I'm out.
This is the number one. One is the loneliest number that you'll ever do. Two can be as bad as one. It's the loneliest number since the number one. One is the loneliest number that you'll ever do. Since the number one. One is the loneliest number that you'll ever do. Two can be as bad as one. It's the loneliest number since the number